Welcome to The Power of Now What, a podcast on overcoming the various challenges and problems that one encounters when on the spiritual path, when on a spiritual journey, when engaged in a practice such as meditation, and even post awakening and post enlightenment itself. This is episode 10 on the subject of getting it and then losing it. I can't think of a particularly snappy title for this. I don't believe that there is a singular terminology used for this phenomena. I've just noticed that it's a very common issue in spirituality when people are trying to awaken or find enlightenment, find satori, whatever you would like to term it. It's commonly asked to spiritual teachers and gurus and guides about why this keeps happening, that in meditation or during a spiritual practice, having huge awakening experiences and really experiencing that amazing presence, just very firmly experiencing truly that it's only ever the present moment, that there is no future, there is no past, it's only ever now. And not just the understanding of this intellectually, but truly feeling this on a very deeply felt experiential level, that undeniable understanding, an undeniable confirmation that the present moment is all there ever is. It has never once been the past. It could never be the future. It's only ever now. And furthermore to that, as it transpires, you are the consciousness of the present moment. You are not the individual, temporary, finite, separate self that you have believed yourself to be thus far. And you are actually the conscious, present awareness of this singular, infinite moment. And the feeling is total bliss, profound, deep, deeper than anything you've ever experienced before. Even deeper than the profound peace you feel looking at sunsets and these brief glimpses of profound realization in normal life. It goes even beyond that. It's it is like waking up from a nightmare. That's how it feels. And because that is essentially what's happening. You are waking up from a delusional, illusory reality and waking into the actual reality. And the feeling is of total relief because in that moment you become deathless. You've finally overcome the mortal terror that's been following you around your entire life. And every single problem you've ever had becomes utterly irrelevant, completely disarmed, neutralized. That's where the bliss and peace comes from. Even the deepest, most persistent psychological issues that follow you around have simply vanished. Now, often, when people are engaged earnestly in a meditative practice and a spiritual journey, they will have this experience at some point. Sometimes people have it spontaneously without any previous background in any spiritual matters at all. There are some very famous examples of this where all of a sudden people just suddenly have this realization and are permanently established in that state. It's that spontaneous enlightenment. And that happens to the lucky few of us, really. um, in the majority of cases, it tends to be a little more gradual. However, there are huge, big firework awakening experiences that happen along the way. And what often happens is people have an experience like that and naturally feel like, oh, I've done it. I've got it. I've achieved the permanent enlightened state. Very much feeling like that was it. Because in that moment, all of your problems have completely vanished. And because you recognize it's only ever the present moment, how could it leave? How could it go? And that's part of the relief and part of the bliss that you feel is the knowledge that this is not an experience, this is reality and will always be like this. Always. It can't change ever. so so it's very frustrating and at times very demoralizing and depressing, I would say, as well, when over some time that feeling of bliss and peace fades and you begin to feel like you're losing it. You're losing that feeling, and even quite dramatically sometimes you can almost realize that years later, oh, I'm back in all of my suffering, I'm back in all of my problems. Hang on a minute, when did this happen? That feeling of like, wait a minute. It's almost like if you were like walking along a path in a forest, just having a nice time, and then all of a sudden realizing, wait a minute, I've gotten lost. I've completely veered off the track now, and I'm wandering aimlessly through a forest, and you can't place where you lost it. So you can't place where at what point and what happened in order for you to get lost, because the path was so clear not so long ago, and now I'm lost again. So I'd like to speak a little bit on why this happens in the first place, how it happens, why it's a problem, why it's such a common problem, give a bit of my experience with this, and give a few a few pointers, hopefully, to get more permanently established within the awakening itself, to really, really make this the permanent state of bliss that we are striving. Words are so difficult, team. I gotta say, it's talking on all of these matters is almost impossible because striving isn't the right word, obviously. We can't strive towards something that's already here. It's always here anyway. But so language is a very imperfect tool that I have to work with, but I'm going to do my best with the words that I've got. So that state of bliss that we are working towards, we want to be permanently established in that, in presence, permanently established in presence. I want to give some of my to tips, understandings, pointers, and insights that might help to stay there, to not get lost. Maybe I can say, hang on, don't veer off the path, stay on the path, otherwise you'll get lost. So, I believe that there are a few reasons why this happens in the first place. And the first one is that it's almost an inherent issue in presence itself. The feeling itself almost inevitably leads to a bit of complacency. Now, I'll try to explain what I mean by that, because the present moment inherently has a very real feeling of permanence to it, because the present moment is ever present. It's always here. And when your consciousness is fully aligned with the present moment, there is a natural feeling of permanence that will pervade through the egoic body mind. Your current mind structure, however you perceive the world, whatever your current framework for understanding and orienting yourself in the world is, will almost inevitably have a sense of permanence to the state of presence, because presence itself is eternal. It's eternally now. It is infinitely now, the present moment. And eternity is not a length of time. Eternity doesn't have a beginning and an end, and therefore is not a length of time. Infinity isn't something that will happen in the future. Infinity isn't a length of time that we are moving towards. That is the illusion that's dropping when we become present. That's the illusion that disappears. Eternity didn't begin in the past. Infinity didn't start in the past. The present moment didn't begin, and it's not going to end. It's eternally ever present, always has been, and always will be. So when you wake up to that reality, there is naturally a sense of permanence that will pervade through the egoic body mind, the the ego structure, the sense of the personal identity will misinterpret the eternal present moment as a as a permanent state. And we have to understand that enlightenment isn't a state. Enlightenment isn't a state of mind. It is the eradication of identification with the mind. The mind will continue in various different forms throughout eternity. It will carry on, but you've ceased identification with the mind. So the present moment isn't subject to states, because states come and go. States can be up, down, left, right, negative, positive, anything. States are temporary, whereas presence isn't a state. So the mind interprets this newfound awakening as a permanent state, which is a misdirection. It's a misunderstanding. It's a beautiful misunderstanding, and it's a very profound misunderstanding, and it's certainly a sign that something's going right. We're going in the right direction if we feel, oh, excellent, I found a permanent state. But but that's a trick. The ego is so full of tricks and traps. The mind has so many clever little hooks and backdoors, and it's the mind will always want to try and put a narrative, put its own old beliefs, old frameworks, and old structures onto this awareness that you are awakening into. So there is a natural complacency that begins to happen with the ego and the body mind, because there is something that feels so securely permanent about presence that we feel like we don't need to be vigilant anymore. We feel like we don't need to meditate anymore. We feel like we don't need to do our spiritual practice anymore because, ta-da, I found it. I found the thing. So that's the first reason why I believe that we can get it and then lose it, is the misunderstanding of the body mind that it's a permanent state when it's not. It's awakening to the reality of presence being eternal. And because of that, there is a complacency that almost it causes the body mind to drop its guard. The second reason that I believe this happens, this kind of getting it and losing it happens, is that this goes against our usual methodology of ingraining a habit. So when we become awakened, this may have happened earlier on in your meditative journey, your spiritual journey as well. You you can only work with the tools that you have, and most likely you've been trying to establish this, approaching it like you're trying to achieve a goal, because that's how we've been taught to approach our lives. We set a goal and then we work towards achieving it. That's the normal method of trying to make something happen in the world. And so naturally, we apply that to enlightenment. Now, enlightenment isn't subject to Pavlovian conditioning, unfortunately. So let's compare this to a different goal that you might have. Like, so I often use the physical body as an analogy because it's a beautiful analogy. Let's say you have the goal, you want to start running, you want to get into the habit of running because you want to run 10 kilometers, you want to enter a 10K race. So you set about trying to begin the habit of running, and you've never ran before. So you get some trainers, you go out and you start chugging away, pounding the pavement, trying to start jogging. And naturally, this is incredibly painful. It's a lot, and you don't enjoy it, and it's hard work. You have to go out in the rain. You have to go out when it's cold, when it's dark, when you're tired from your job, when you're stressed from other commitments. But you make yourself do it because you know that if you keep doing it, eventually it will become a habit, meaning eventually you will start doing it automatically. And once the running has become a habit, it becomes far easier to put those trainers on and get out, even when it's raining, even when it's tired. The habit itself gives you some momentum. And suddenly you start having some runs and jogging that feels good. It feels like a good thing. And the way that the body mind is constructed, I mean, it's based on, when we build habits, it's all based on our dopamine receptors. Anything that stimulates that dopamine eventually will become a very attractive thought to follow. So this is what happens in addiction. We overstimulate the dopamine through a certain stimulus, and then we crave it all the time. And in a way, that's what we're trying to make happen when we're putting a healthy habit in place, because the more you run, the more we get that dopamine response. And eventually, you actually start looking forward to the run. You actually start looking forward to putting your trainers on and going out. And I'd highly recommend it, by the way. The physical training will save your life. Highly recommend it. Now, because this is our usual hand, you can apply that to anything when you're trying to achieve something academically, professionally, romantically, financially, whatever your goal is. It this framework works for that. But when it comes to awakening and enlightenment, unfortunately, something isn't the same about doing that. It works up to a point, because in many ways meditation is a habit that can be ingrained in that way, utilizing the dopamine response. After all, I mean, I'm a meditation coach, and I'll admit meditation is hard as nails. It is hard work. You have to set the time aside. You have to sit there even when you're uncomfortable, if you're bored, tired, frustrated, whatever it is. And it's not easy. Meditation is a very difficult habit to get into, but you can ingrain this habit, and it will start giving you a bit of that dopamine response, making it a bit easier to do. So in the early days, it's almost like I've heard the analogy before of the meditation really is the boat that takes you to the island. But once you get to the island, you have got to burn that boat. So, meditation and many of the things we do on a spiritual path in order to get to awakening is a habit. but the awakened experience itself, the recognition, the understanding, and the immersing of your consciousness into infinite universal consciousness, that's different. That's different because infinite universal consciousness actually has almost nothing to do with the body mind at all. What happens there is you become aware that everything leading up to this point was an illusion, that the entire time your entire life has been going on, you've made a fundamental error in perception. Your perception and perspective has been thoroughly and utterly convinced that I am this individual body. I am a brain inside a body, and that's me. The awakened, enlightened understanding, recognition, is that is how it appears, but it's not the reality. The reality is that infinite universal consciousness is everywhere, including this body and mind. This body and mind is confused and has made an error, trying egoically to control the world by acting, behaving, and thinking in various ways, which inevitably leads to disaster. So, how this relates to getting it and then losing it is that because when we hit the enlightened experience, we come to that recognition and whoa, it feels permanent. Because our usual methodology of doing things is that once you've achieved something, let's say you get up to be able to do that 10K run, by the time you can do that 10K run, running is such an ingrained habit that it becomes easy to do the 10K run. You've ran so often that even that running 10K now is nothing. It's just a standard Saturday jog. You can run that 10K. Because that's our usual methodology for achieving things, when you quote unquote achieve enlightenment, you mistakenly think it's going to be easy to remain in that state. Again, we get complacent because with everything else, once something is ingrained in your brain, it becomes automatic. But awakening is something you have to do moment to moment. It doesn't end. That's partly what makes it unique and ultimate. That's what makes it the final, the gateless gate, as it's said in Buddhism, in Zen, the gateless gate, the last thing to get through that wasn't a thing at all, the gateless gate. Because it's permanent. You remain established there. And that's not the same. That is not the same as your brain automatically going to presence. Instead, it's about understanding the eternal nature of presence. The third reason that I believe we get it and then lose it is because your ego comes back often with a vengeance. They say when a recovering alcoholic relapses into drinking again, he makes up for lost time. And it's true. Speaking as a recovered alcoholic, I went through it and had a couple of relapses. And yeah, that's no joke. You do make up for lost time. You absolutely hammer it. And I think the ego and the identification with an individual body mind does the same kind of thing. Once it's got its claws back in you and you've started to identify as an individual again, even a little bit, even one small little thing that you do, it's got you and it pulls you right back in. And it will find it will find anything, your particular little thing. It will try so many different avenues to get you back. It will push your buttons, you know. The world knows how to push your buttons because it put them there in the first place. So I think that that's one of the reasons why we get it and then lose it, is because I don't want to say your ego takes revenge on you, because that makes it sound like it's an entity with a will of its own. It's more that I mean, being in the awakened state can feel very unstable, because you kind of flail around for a little bit, because your entire framework of belief and understanding and orienting yourself in the world changes. And occasionally you just get this your mind is trying to latch on to something to make sense of what's happening, and so it will latch on to an old belief or an old framework. I mean, my background really is ultra atheistic and scientific. It wasn't until I awakened that I realized that's just a belief too. It's just a belief system. It pretends it's not a belief system very convincingly, but it is a belief system, because you cannot experience your brain. You everything you've been taught on some level, you have to believe in order for it to establish as the framework with which you understand the world. Anyway, so when you awaken and recognize the infinite universal conscious nature of everything, and that actually ultimately everything is an illusion, you have to drop away these beliefs, including the belief in a world, a universe that is made of something called matter. It's not made of matter, it's made of consciousness. It's made of consciousness. You've never experienced anything outside of consciousness, and you will never experience anything outside of consciousness. Now, that is a lot for an individual brain and body mind to cope with. And therefore, it does go through sometimes, I spoke a lot in the Dark Night of the Soul episode about this, because you flail around looking for some way of explaining what's happened. And if you try to latch on to something, that it's got you. You're right back into old beliefs, old ways of thinking, and it won't be long until you are fully identified with an individual ego once again. And it will lead to suffering. That's a crucial understanding. That is the only result of egoic activity. As long as you are under the belief that your essential nature is being an individual temporary body, you are doomed. Doomed. I really are like, I know that sounds depressing, but it's true. There's no way around it. It's the ego identified state is it is the suffering itself, because you're trying to avoid pain and you're trying to achieve happiness. That's all the ego ever does. That's the reason for its existence. And because it's always trying to do that, it's always going to be unhappy. By definition, by its own nature, it has to be unsatisfied. It's satisfied for very brief moments of time, sometimes even seconds, by trying to achieve material things. That could be either something like achieving a new status in society, or finding that new relationship, or trying a new substance. And these are very brief, temporary, ultimately unsatisfying things that work for a little while, but eventually that doesn't work either. Now, so that's the very nature of the ego itself. Its inherent nature is dissatisfaction. If you were fully, completely satisfied, the ego wouldn't exist in the first place. So when the ego comes back with a vengeance, you're going to suffer, and because you've now tasted true satisfaction, you have tasted true, complete fulfillment and total peace. Being engaged in the ego now feels twice as painful, if not more. It becomes unbearable, which is actually a blessing. It will help you, because the ego starts to become such a claustrophobic and agonizing place to be. It starts to become it's like it doesn't work anymore. This state, the ego identified state, doesn't work for me anymore. I don't want to. It's not working for me. Being a person isn't working for me, and your only option remains as full enlightenment. When you're at that stage, you're well on the way. You're well on the way. It does only become a matter of time at that point, when you truly recognize, yeah, this isn't working. I need, especially if you've tasted that satori, that taste of awakening, that taste of bliss. When you've had a taste of that, there's no going back. There really isn't. You will temporarily re-identify with the ego, but that will be an unbearable state to be in, and you will want nothing else other than to be liberated permanently from that agonizing egoic state. So, in my experience, what are some of the understandings, insights, and pointers that can help us when we are in when we have fully established in presence, when we are fully immersed in presence and universal consciousness, how to recognize the pull of the ego, and with a deep understanding, how can we remain conscious? If we fall unconscious, that is going back into the ego. But to remain conscious is to become aware even of the ego's tricks and traps, that it will try and pull you out of the awakened state and back into the individual person. If we're prepared for it, if we have such a deep understanding that when these little tricks and traps arise, you can see it so clearly, it has no power to pull you out of that state. The first one is acceptance. Acceptance. Because the real key to this permanent establishment in bliss is to untangle your consciousness from the ego. As I was just mentioning, the ego itself is resistance to the present moment. The ego either dislikes what is happening or wants something that is not happening in the present moment. I'll say that again. The ego is either disliking something that is happening in the present, or wants something that is not in the present. So the ego resists the present moment. The solution to that is true and total acceptance of the now. And so many disciplines, faiths, religions, philosophies, and practices all really emphasize acceptance. To truly To truly find peace, in religious terminology, it's to truly be one with God. They talk of surrender. Surrender. It's so important. Surrender. Surrender gets a bit of surrender almost has a negative connotation to it. The word surrender has a negative connotation, but it's the closest thing we really have in in the English language to total acceptance. Surrender to the present moment, because to us it sounds like cowardly. It sounds like giving up. Surrendering is giving up. I surrender to the enemy. So it's not about that. I suppose acceptance is a better word, because to surrender feels submissive. To surrender feels like a defeat. The word implies that anyway. Whereas acceptance is essentially a total surrender. It's saying, all right, it's the ego that has to give up. Infinite universal consciousness cannot know defeat. It can't be submissive or dominant. It can't be either. It just is. Everything just is as it is now. The ego has to give up. The ego has to recognize the futility of its actions, constantly trying to resist inevitable, inevitable discomfort in life. A lot of life just is straight up uncomfortable. And the ego has to give up and surrender its selfish desires, because the ego's selfish desires are only what it thinks it wants. But it has to recognize eventually that what it thinks it wants isn't what it actually wants. Because every time it gets what it wants, it still isn't satisfied. There's no end to the suffering, because the ego cannot be satisfied due to its own nature. But if the ego can fully surrender, we are in the state of acceptance. And when acceptance is our habitual, ingrained response to the world around us, then remaining established in pure consciousness does become a lot easier. A lot easier. You have to accept everything, because the moment you start resisting something, you're back in ego. The moment you start desiring something from the perspective of the individual, you are back in ego. Acceptance is the remedy for this. Acceptance, full and total. And look, you gotta be almost unreasonable in your level of acceptance. When I was suffering really bad chronic pain, that taught me acceptance to a level I didn't think was possible. I didn't think it was possible to to teach fitness classes while standing there in chronic pain. I didn't think that was possible. But through a radical, unreasonable total acceptance, that too was possible. You'd be surprised what you can accept. A lot of speakers, philosophers and thinkers over the years that have given serious thought to how to actually be happy have acceptance as a core tenet of what they recommend. So, practicing acceptance, that's my first tip. The second is we have to understand what the infinite universal consciousness what it's very difficult to talk about, but we have to try and understand what it is. In essence, what is the awakening itself. It's the relinquishing, the surrender of the ego. It is not a new age method of making the ego feel good or getting what it wants. That's not what presence is. And so many people fall into the trap of trying to use this spirituality as just another method of trying to satisfy the ego, trying to satisfy this personal narrative. We need to get rid of it. You need to get rid of the narrative. This is jumping over the moon. Get rid of the narrative. Get rid of the ego. If you're trying to use a present state in order to achieve more success in life, in order to have better relationships, in order to gain material wealth, in order to get laid more, in order to avoid uh, uncomfortable situations. If you're trying to grab and hold on to infinite universal consciousness for the ego's own gain, you are setting yourself up for total failure. You're setting yourself up to fail. It doesn't work like that. Remain immersed within the present moment in infinite universal consciousness, and all of those things happen naturally. Naturally. They just begin to happen spontaneously. But you won't even care. Yeah, you will care, but you won't mind when anything happens. You might just through now that the individual body mind is established in presence, infinite universal consciousness, it becomes so much more pleasant to be around. It becomes more productive almost by accident. It begins to do things that are more aligned with its true nature. It gains deep insights and intuitions about everything that is happening around it. And so naturally, material successes and advantages happen as a byproduct, just by accident. But when they do, it's not like, oh, hey, now I've made it, now I've achieved it. No, it happens as an unintentional byproduct. You don't mind either way. They said Krishnamurti, actually, on his deathbed, it's a great quote. When he was on his deathbed, one of his followers said, is there any final teaching? Is there any final bit of wisdom that you can give us about how to do this, how to find this total enlightenment? What is your secret? And Krishnamurti said, my secret is this: I don't mind what happens. And that's it. And there's no better way of putting it than that. Don't mind what happens, good or bad. And especially don't try to use enlightenment to get what you want. You will naturally start living a better life. But when that happens, you won't mind either way, because you're already happy. You can't be anything other than happy. Everything is made of happiness, as they say in the tantric tradition. Everything is made of happiness. That has to be experienced. That won't be understood. But everything is ultimately made of happiness, made of love. So the last little the understanding, the pointing that I have is that what will happen at some point is, because the body mind isn't suddenly liberated from the usual stresses, strains, and setbacks that usually happen in our conventional, ordinary understanding of life. And because naturally these things happen, something is going to require your attention at some point. Like it's quite easy to remain in the infinite universal consciousness when everything's going great, right? Right? Like, well, it would be easy to stay in that state. Let's say if you were like on holiday, it's like, well, the reason we enjoy holidays is because we naturally become very present there anyway. There's less pressure, there's less demand on your attention, so you're kind of already there present. So let's say you're in life circumstances where miraculously things are going okay for you, and you don't have a great deal of stresses or strains on you at that time, and you happen to come across the awakening, an awakening, an enlightenment experience, then you stay in that presence until things start to get difficult again. And when life gets difficult and challenging, we find it harder to accept the present moment. We find it harder to surrender to the present moment, and our attention is dragged and pulled into the illusory external world. There is no external world, by the way. External and internal are the same thing. We are conscious of both, and they are the same thing. There is no external world, but it seems like there is. And when the usual constraints of life, setbacks, stresses, catastrophes happen, our attention gets pulled back into it. And this is where we believe, oh, it's now becoming harder to stay present. But here is the crucial thing. No matter what is happening, no matter what your experience contains, it's only ever the present moment, regardless of where your attention is. In the early days, it feels like it's hard to stay present. But further down the line, you realize you can't be anything but present. It's done for you. That's the relief. That's the release from the burden. Recognize it's done for you. This is not something you have to create. This is not something you have to do. It's already there. It's already now. You are already infinite universal consciousness. The goal is already achieved. It's already achieved. That's why it's not a goal that can be achieved. It's always there. Always. It's always now. You can't go into the past. There is no past. There is no future. These things are illusions. And fully established in presence is to understand, even if you got lost in the most vivid memory, you had the most intense memory arising, and you gave it your full attention, you would be paying attention to a memory that is occurring in the present. Even if you were terrified beyond belief about an event that you have imagined could happen in the future, an anxious panic attack, thinking about something that may happen in the future, those thoughts are still only arising in the present moment. And there is nothing that you can do to leave the present. There is no way of doing it. It can't be done. This is where the truly permanent enlightenment becomes established. There's nothing you can do. This is the most beautiful submission and surrender of all. And this is why people burst out laughing when they finally get it. Because it can't go wrong. You can't not be present. It can't be done. You're always here. It's always now. And now is not a moment in time. There is no time. There's no time. Time requires the mind. And that's ultimately an illusion. Eternity isn't going to begin when you become enlightened. It's not like you achieve enlightenment, and then an infinite, marvelous state begins. It's the recognition that it's been happening the entire time. And no matter what you do, no matter what you say, however you act, wherever you go, whatever happens, whatever happens within your experience, it will still be now. You cannot leave. You can't, even if you wanted to. Even if you wanted to, it can't be done. And you can't not be conscious. Have you ever experienced an experience that you were not conscious of? It can't be done. No matter what happens in your experience, it will be experienced. And experience is just another name for consciousness, knowing, a conscious knowing of what is happening. You cannot leave consciousness. It's always there, and it's always now. That is where the liberation becomes irreversible. It's an irreversible enlightenment to recognize the eternal nature of consciousness. It's the one thing that you can't not be. How incredible is that? How amazing! It's a relief from the perceived effort that you've put in up to this point. Because up to the point of awakening, you feel like it's frustrating. You have to strive towards it. You have to work towards it. It requires strict discipline. It requires immense personal sacrifice. It requires the hardest disciplines that you've ever had to go through, new understandings, new teachings, missteps, confusion, going the wrong way, listening to the wrong person, then finding another one, and then life setbacks happen and life happens. And all along that path, all along that journey, there are tiny little brief glimpses into presence and awakening. And then, and it, and it feels like it's hard to stay conscious. But finally, after all of that striving, after all of that futile searching, realizing that conscious is the one thing that you can't not be. You are conscious always. Always. Recognizing that the infinite universal consciousness itself is beautifully neutral to any experience. It is open, empty, spacious, and clear, and is naturally accepting of anything that happens. There is the freedom, because it doesn't matter anymore what the events are, the life situations, the circumstances, the troubles of the day just become almost irrelevant. It just runs in the background as you go soft focus, and as infinite universal consciousness, just enjoy experience. Enjoying experience, but the experiencer, the individual experiencer, disappears. And when that is established and understood, you are free from the cycle of getting it, then losing it. Because there is no losing it. You can't lose it. It can't be lost. You can't lose the one thing that you always are. You can't lose the one thing that you always are. Everything else in your experience of life is temporary. Everything else. Everything else comes and goes. Everything changes and is changing. As the Zen poem says, everything in this world changes and is changing, but the moon keeps on shining. Your consciousness is that moonlight that is constantly shining. Everything else is subject to being a temporary, ever changing state. Consciousness itself doesn't change. It's not temporary, it's permanent. Open, empty, spacious, clear, accepting of all experience. There is no getting it. There is no losing it. It always is. It always is now. And it is always you. And they're my thoughts on the phenomena of getting it and losing it. Thank you so much for listening, team. I cannot tell you how grateful I am for the response to these podcasts. It's all fantastic. Please keep it coming. I'm really appreciating the likes, the subscribes. Oh, remember to subscribe, by the way. I forgot to do the plug in there. Dang it. Dang. Remember to whack that subscribe and like button. Remember to follow me on Spotify. You can find me on Facebook, Corin Bryant, meditation coach and personal trainer. You can find me on Instagram, Corin_Bryant_, and watch this space because I have lots coming up, and it's all onwards and upwards from here, team. I hope you're all well out there. I hope everyone's doing amazingly well on their spiritual journey. I hope my words are helpful in some small way. And if not, we can at least enjoy having a blast along the way, huh? Take care. Be well. And stay present.